Well, hello there. You are watching the press preview. A first look at what is on the front pages as they arrive. With me, as you can see this evening, to look at those headlines, I'll be joined by the journalist and broadcaster Jenny Kleeman and the broadcaster and commentator Ali Miraj. It's lovely to see you both. As ever, then, we take a look, first of all, at the front pages. The Sun carries more allegations in the BBC presenter controversy, claiming that the unnamed broadcaster broke COVID-19 lockdown rules to meet a third young person. BBC staff facing fresh claims is how the Metro reports news that a second person had earlier come forward with allegations against the man who is already accused of paying for explicit images over one youngster. Well, that development is also lead for the Daily Telegraph as well. The Eye goes into more detail about the allegations involving the second person, saying that the presenter is accused of sending them abusive messages after they hinted they might identify him. The Times, too, concentrates on those alleged abusive threats. Away from the BBC, The Guardian says the Chancellor has told ministers that there will be no extra money for a 6% pay rise for public sector workers. The Daily Mail claims an exclusive with a story that China sent a spy to the House of Commons to eavesdrop on a meeting between MPs and Hong Kong dissidents. Well, the Financial Times leads with the battle by Microsoft to take over another company, Activision Blizzard, in the face of opposition from the US trade regulator. And The Star says scientists are working on what it calls a warp-speed rocket that could get to Mars in just 30 days. Well, a reminder, by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us, specifically our guests. So let's head straight to Jenny and Ali. It's lovely to see you both, obviously. But clearly, we've got a lot to talk about. Let's start with The Sun, new in. Jenny, you kick us off. So we have the first young person who, via their lawyer, sent a letter to the BBC saying that the allegations made in The Sun's original article were rubbish. Now the BBC says a second young person has come through, and now The Sun talks about at least one more person. And the allegation is that the BBC unnamed star broke lockdown rules to meet this young person.
It's really difficult to keep up with all of this. But yes, this third set of allegations is that this BBC presenter in February 2021 broke lockdown rules to meet up with another young person. And if you're finding it difficult to keep up, the one thing that you can grab hold of is the idea that these stories are relentless. They keep coming. And there is a sense now that this presenter's position is untenable. You have people like Jeremy Vine, who has nearly 800,000 followers on Twitter, tweeting that this presenter needs to come out and explain himself. We know that this person's name has been circulating on social media. We know that they've been suspended, and at some point people are going to work out that this presenter is not on air. So we're in this kind of absurd situation. And there is this sense that the papers are baying for blood. The BBC today came out with this story, the second allegation, which I mean, maybe we'll come to the details of this second allegation. But to me, that seems to be quite different in texture to the rest of these. But in many ways, I think the BBC has made a rod for its own back in that it was so voracious in its coverage of the Philip Schofield scandal. I remember getting on my phone, breaking news alerts several times a day on a Saturday saying, Holly Willoughby has been on Instagram saying how disappointed she is. And as such, we now have this public appetite for these stories about TV stars and pushing them off their pedestals, that it almost doesn't matter what the substance of the stories are. There is now a momentum to them. This momentum is going to continue. No doubt more stories will come forward. This BBC presenter, their name is one day going to come out, somebody's going to say it by mistake, or it's going to be so absurd that anybody who wants to find this person's name will be able to find it online. And so it's a kind of symptom, really, of how our kind of parallel social media is in a different world to us here on broadcast media, but also how we, as a public, and the newspapers, particularly when it comes to the BBC, have such a bloodlust for people that they're just going to keep on going until this person's career is over. And we don't know the substance of a lot of these allegations. There is so much that we don't know. And in fact, when it comes to the original allegations, it seems that the more we know, the less we know. So I feel it's a very, very strange situation that says a lot about how we live today, I think.
Yeah, because of the aforementioned letter that was sent to the BBC via this young person's lawyer, and of the Sun for today were asking how did they afford the lawyer?
Yes.
Which became a whole other ballgame, didn't it? And certainly we had Tim Davie today, or at least the world at one did, speaking to the BBC and not to everybody else who'd like to speak to him on the day that the annual report came out, saying that it's great we have free speech. Most nations don't, or 70-odd% of nations don't. Therefore, the BBC newsroom can pursue it. And so they did with this second allegation that came out.
They did, yeah, indeed. And the second allegations come out. And just to your point, Jenny, about the public baying for blood, when we're baying for blood, I would just like to mention two names in that context. One is Paul Gambaccini, the other one is Cliff Richard. We have to be very, very careful about trial by social media. We need to dial this down. If there impropriety has taken place of a criminal nature or otherwise, if BBC standards and protocols have been breached, both of those things need to be investigated. So there's a police investigation going on the one hand. The BBC...
Or not an investigation,
or
an examination,
of the facts to see if there's something there to be done. And the BBC, I'm sure, will have its own questions to answer. But we need to not jump to conclusions without knowing the facts. And the point you raised, Jenny, quite rightly, is that the original allegation that was brought by the parents, as I understand it, the lawyers of the individual concerned are now saying that there's no truth to this. So it is very confusing. I think we need to dial it down. And what I would say to the likes of Jeremy Vine, who I have a lot of time and respect for, is that we just need to be careful and let the due process take its course. But it is very unedifying, and it's difficult for the BBC, particularly on the back of Gary Lineker issues and other things generally about the BBC's had a tough time. And it is not an easy period for them.
And there have been questions about the Sun. You know, where is your evidence? Where are the bank statements in case one?
Yes.
The questions for the BBC, as we heard from Tim Davie today, about the timeline and whether protocols were actually pursued. Before we come on to the detail of the second, let's just examine that. So, first of all, we found out that the parents went to a BBC office and then phoned a number, and then there was an email and a telephone call back from the BBC, neither of which came to fruition, effectively. And then it was left for several weeks, is what we learnt today. Tim Davie saying red flags probably not raised quickly enough. You know, where are we at with what the BBC did for the original claim?
I would say that that is the substance of what there is to look at here. Is the BBC complaints procedure quick enough? Can it identify problems soon enough? Clearly, in this case, it failed because the parents involved went to the Sun rather than trusting that the BBC was going to deal with this. But the BBC is a very large organisation with a lot of people on screen. There are a lot of people that complain to the BBC about a lot of things. I'm sure there are a lot of people who make allegations about high-profile stars that have no substance. Of course, the BBC must take everything seriously, particularly when it involves a duty of care to a minor, a young person, and serious allegations like this. But you can understand why they wouldn't immediately take somebody off air. I mean, yes, it sounds like emails weren't looked at. It says there was an attempt to make a phone call, but contact didn't go through, which I don't know if that means that the number wasn't right or they got a voicemail, but clearly they could have tried harder. But you have to look at this in the context of a public service broadcaster with a lot of household names and a lot of people who make malicious claims like this. Often, I have been at the BBC and seen the log. There are some really crazy people that call in all the time. There's a lot of comments to go through.
Well, 250 in 6 months, I think, is what Tim Davie said. So let's look at the eye then. BBC presenter accused of sending abusive message to a second person. Young person claims they were sent abusive, expletive-filled messages by the BBC star after they hinted they might reveal his identity. That was one. And also the Metro with the same story, BBC star facing fresh claims.
We don't know we just read what we see here. It's very difficult to discern what happened. We don't know the kind of text messages that were exchanged. I mean, if someone was trying to reveal the identity of a very famous person, that itself is concerning. Obviously, that's no excuse for giving allegedly expletive-filled text messages.
But it might cause panic, I suppose.
I suppose, but then, you know, we don't know the circumstances. But
well, there are some things we do know. We do know that this person was in their 20s. They were not a minor, they were not a child. We do know that this was on a dating app. We know that the BBC verified this phone number, so it is the phone number of the presenter. I have to say, this sounds like a very unpleasant experience for this person on the dating app, but a lot of unpleasant experiences happen on dating apps. This is not in the same realm as my 17-year-old child was given money in exchange for sexually explicit pictures, which is the original claim, which the Sun is kind of rolling back on in a way. I mean, these latest allegations are much softer than those. So I think we need to look at this second allegation in the context of that. I'm sure this was very unpleasant. I'm sure nobody likes to be abused and sent threatening messages. But this is a 20-year-old on a dating app.
But also, as we read it, Jenny, we don't know. It seems like the abuse may have started after the threat to name the individual concerned.
Yes, that's
right,
how
which would be quite
reads.
concerning if you're a very reputable household name presenter, as we understand it, that someone would threaten you with that. I find that also a bit unsavoury. So we just don't know exactly.
And it is in the context of, I mean, you know, the whole Philip Schofield, his defence was that it was ill-advised but not illegal. It is ill-advised if you're a famous person to be being abusive. But, you know, in the Philip Schofield case, the person involved was somebody who he was in a position of power over at work. There is no suggestion of any of this. The problem is we're lumping all these things in together. It is turning into a giant story that has massive momentum. I'm sure that there will be more stories that break, but at the moment I feel really sorry for the young people involved in this, and I feel sorry for this BBC presenter, and I feel sorry for other BBC presenters who've been drawn into it. It is a sorry state of affairs.
And the point about allegation number one, refuted as rubbish, as we know, is that under the age of 18, the sharing of explicit material, you know, you're counted as a child up to 18, even though the age of consent is 16. And, of course, the Sun's latest allegation about the breaking of lockdown laws is something also that might draw the police's attention. Telegraph also going with this. BBC sex scandal presenter facing a new allegation. The new case involves a second individual in their early 20s who claimed they were contacted anonymously by the presenter via a dating app, then subjected to threatening and abusive messages. So that was the one released by BBC News, as you said. Meantime, the other questions for The Sun we've talked about is where's their evidence? And secondly, for the BBC, the other elements that came out with Tim Davie, that he has chosen not to speak to the presenter involved, that he is overseeing, you know, effectively all of it, not just that part of it, spoken by a senior manager, and refusing to say whether what the presenter had said, whether they had resigned. You know, in a sense, they didn't give us so much information because they've had to give up their investigation while the police look at it.
Well, this is where due process comes in, and this is where I think Tim Davie, it was right that he went out on the airwaves today. Obviously, the annual report of the BBC was out, so he had no choice. He was asked some pretty robust questions by his own journalists, actually, on this, as you would expect. But if, obviously, the police are now looking into this matter, that has to take precedence. And I'm sure that the BBC will, in time, have to do its own investigation into what happened and how it handled it and how quickly it responded to some of these claims.